The glass left her hand before her voice did. For a split second, the dining room seemed to pause, the low hum of the chandelier, the faint ticking of the clock, the smell of roasted lamb and Cabernet. And then the sound exploded. Shards burst across the table like frozen rain, one slicing through the air before grazing my cheek. Warmth spread down my neck, red against white silk. Margaret's eyes were wide, her lipstick smudged her hand, still extended, as if she could pull the moment back before gravity finished its work. Ryan shouted my name, but his voice felt far away, muffled by the roar in my own head. I did not scream. I did not move. The years of courtroom training, the discipline, the posture, the restraint anchored me in place. It wasn't the first time she'd thrown something at me, but it was the first time I didn't flinch. I reached for a napkin, pressed it against my skin, and looked at the woman across from me, my mother-in-law, the matriarch who had turned dinner into a battlefield. "You ungrateful girl!" she spat, slurring the last word, as if it carried all the weight of her authority. "When I ask for more wine, you pour it." The crimson stain on the carpet looked almost deliberate, like an artist's brushstroke. Ryan grabbed her wrist, stammering something about calming down, but she yanked free, laughing a high, brittle sound that filled the corners of the room. I could smell the alcohol on her breath from where I stood. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my career defending victims of violence, explaining to juries that silence was not weakness, but survival. And now, standing in her home bleeding quietly at her table, I realized silence could also be evidence. My reflection in the wine glass, still upright beside my plate, looked back at me with detached clarity. A cut minor. A witness unwilling. A woman suddenly awake. Margaret leaned closer, voice soft but venomous. "Don't make this bigger than it is, sweetheart." I folded the napkin, turned toward the door, and said evenly, "Dinner is over." The glass broke, but something else inside me stayed intact. Before the glass there was order, or at least the illusion of it. Margaret Caldwell's house ran like a courtroom where she was judge, jury, and bailiff. Even the air felt supervised. She liked her dinners served at 7 sharp, her china polished, her wine decanted hours in advance. When I first married Ryan, I mistook her rituals for elegance. Over time, I understood they were laws disguised as manners. "Discipline keeps chaos away," she used to say, tapping her ring against the rim of her wine glass like a gavel. Ryan had grown up inside that echo, so he never questioned it. He was gentle, decent, the kind of man who apologized for things that weren't his fault. When his father died, Margaret filled the silence with control, planning, correcting, commanding, and Ryan, desperate to keep the peace, let her. By the time I entered their orbit, the patterns were carved in marble. We'd been married for 3 years when she convinced him we should move into her house for a while. She said it with that soft, persuasive tone older women use when they're offering help they don't intend to give. "It'll help you save for your own place, dear." Why waste money on rent when family has space I wanted to refuse? But Ryan was already nodding, relieved. He'd lost a big client that month, and the idea of security, even Margaret's kind, sounded like comfort. The first few weeks I tried. I offered to cook, cleaned up after dinner, joined her morning coffee ritual, complimented her rose garden. She smiled like a queen receiving tribute. But every kindness was a transaction, every favor an IOU. "You work too much," she'd say when I brought files home. "No wonder my son looks tired." Other times she'd sigh, "Ryan's always been tender-hearted. He needs guidance." The word guidance meant her. I learned to measure my words, to navigate her moods like a lawyer pacing in front of a volatile witness. I could feel the pressure rising, tiny gas leaks of contempt disguised as jokes. "You lawyers think logic can fix everything," she'd tease, eyes sharp over the rim of her glass. I'd smile back, controlled, patient, storing every slight in the quiet corners of my mind. Evenings blurred into weeks and weeks, into a quiet dread. I started counting her refills of wine, watching her gestures loosen, her laughter grow brittle. Something in her needed to dominate even the stillness. I thought of leaving many times, but Ryan would touch my hand, whisper, "She just needs time." So I gave her time. 6 months of it. Until the nighttime ran out and glass shattered the peace she claimed to keep. The day of the dinner started like any other Friday, a ritual built on routine and unease. By late afternoon, the house smelled of rosemary, garlic, and tension. Margaret had insisted we host a proper family evening, which usually meant an audience for her performance of control. I spent the day balancing work calls from my firm and her constant supervision from the kitchen doorway. "You're overseasoning the lamb," she remarked without tasting it. "And please, Emma, when you set the table, use the Waterford crystal, not the plain ones." She always said my name like a verdict. By 6:30, the candles were arranged, the silver polished to mirror brightness, and Margaret was already on her second glass of wine. Ryan texted that he'd be running late from the clinic, leaving me alone with her in the heavy silence that followed the clink of glass against marble. She talked. I nodded, words passing between us like pieces in a game neither of us wanted to play. "You know she began swirling her wine when I was your age. I already had 2 children and a husband who listened." I smiled without responding. Her compliments were always traps baited with comparison. "Ryan tells me you're still chasing partners at your firm." "I suppose ambition has its price." "And success its proof," I said quietly. She blinked surprised, then laughed short, sharp, the sound of metal scraping glass. When Ryan finally arrived, his presence eased the air at least for a while. He kissed my cheek, hugged his mother, and commented on the aroma. I poured him a drink, pretending not to notice how his mother's gaze followed every move I made. Dinner began politely, even pleasantly. The lamb was tender, the conversation safe anchored in weather and work. For a brief stretch I believed we might escape unscathed. But the bottle on the table told a different story. Margaret's glass emptied faster with each round of questions about my hours, my income, my plans for children. Ryan tried to steer the topic elsewhere, but she circled back like a prosecutor with a grudge. "You think success keeps a man warm at night?" she asked, eyes gleaming with a drunk's confidence. I held her stare, unwilling to yield. "Respect does," I answered. Ryan's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Margaret laughed again, louder this time. "Respect," she repeated, pouring more wine until it spilled across the linen. "In this house, respect is knowing your place." She extended the bottle toward me, hand trembling slightly. "Poor dear." I didn't move. "You've had enough," I said softly. It wasn't defiance. It was a boundary. But in that house, boundaries were crimes. The air tightened. She lowered the bottle slowly, eyes narrowing. "Enough," she echoed, voice sharp as the glass soon would be. "No one tells me when enough is enough." The next second stretched like an eternity, the kind of silence that comes right before something irreversible. The bottle clattered onto the table, tipping against a plate, and then her hand moved with terrifying clarity. The wine glass arced through the air, catching the light from the chandelier, a perfect curve of fury. I didn't have time to duck. The impact landed just above my cheekbone, sharp and hot. I heard the crack before I felt the pain. Red spilled down my skin, merging with the wine on the tablecloth until it was impossible to tell which stain belonged to whom. Ryan stood, frozen eyes wide, unable to process what had just happened. The glass shattered at my feet, fragments glinting like tiny verdicts scattered across the floor. "See what you made me do!" Margaret shouted, her voice trembling with false outrage. Her breathing was heavy, uneven, the rhythm of someone drunk on both alcohol and control. She pointed at me as if I were the criminal. "You provoked me standing there with that smug face talking down to me in my own home." Ryan rushed toward me, grabbing a towel, pressing it to my wound. But Margaret's words filled the room, drowning reason. "You've always wanted to turn my son against me," she spat. "Now look at what you've done." Her tone cracked into a sob halfway through the sudden shift, jarring. She fell into a chair, hand to her chest, muttering, "Oh, God, my heart. She's attacking me." It was a performance I'd seen before in other abusers' weaponized fragility. Ryan, desperate to restore order, knelt beside her, voice frantic. "Mom, please, just breathe." I stood still, towel against my face, the pain dulling into something colder, heavier. I watched her, the tears that came on command, the trembling hands that somehow still found the wineglass stem again. The victim mask fit her perfectly. "It was an accident," she whispered when she finally met my eyes. "You startled me." She said it gently, almost kindly, as if rewriting the narrative in real time. My heart pounded, but my voice came out calm. You threw it, I said. I was sitting. Ryan looked between us, torn his face pale. Emma, maybe you should go upstairs clean the cut, he said, pleading. I nodded, not out of obedience, but calculation. Let her think she'd won the scene. Let her drown in her own performance. Upstairs, under the bright bathroom light, I studied my reflection, the blood, the bruise forming the rage simmering beneath composure. I took out my phone, snapped photos close and clear, time-stamped each one. Evidence doesn't lie, I thought. People do. At 12:04 a.m., the house was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint rattle of glass in the dishwasher. I sat at the kitchen counter, a clean bandage now covering the cut above my cheekbone, the pain pulsing in time with my heartbeat. My phone lay beside the untouched cup of tea I'd made hours earlier. The photos were all there, clear, time-stamped, undeniable. For a long time, I just stared at them, debating whether I wanted justice or peace. But peace in this house had always been a performance one that demanded my silence. I picked up the phone and dialed 911. My voice surprised me, steady, calm, almost detached. My name is Emma Caldwell, I said. I'd like to report an assault. The dispatcher asked if I was in immediate danger. I looked around the kitchen, the spotless countertops, the dark doorway leading to the living room where the carpet still bore that red stain. No, I answered softly. Not anymore. The police arrived 30 minutes later, lights dimmed to avoid waking the neighbors. Detective Nora Blake introduced herself, her tone professional but warm, her eyes scanning everything: my face, the floor, the wine bottle still half full on the table. I walked her through the sequence, step by step, the same way I'd outline evidence for a jury. She nodded, taking notes, occasionally glancing at me like she recognized something in my composure. When I showed her the photos, she said quietly, "You've done this before, haven't you?" I met her gaze. "I'm a lawyer." She nodded again, understanding more than I said. Upstairs, I heard a door creak. Ryan's footsteps hesitated halfway down the stairs. "Emma, what's happening?" he whispered, half asleep, half afraid. "Go back to bed," I told him gently. "It's under control." Margaret didn't appear, but I could feel her watching through the darkened hallway, calculating. Detective Blake left me her card, told me she'd file the preliminary report in the morning, and asked if I wanted to press charges. "Yes," I said without hesitation. The word settled into the air like a verdict. As the squad car pulled away, the porch light flickered, catching the reflection of shattered glass by the door. I didn't sweep it up. Evidence has to stay where it falls. By morning, the story had already started to twist. Margaret was a master of rewriting history before breakfast. While I stood by the window waiting for the sun to rise, she was on the phone. Downstairs, soft voice, controlled sobs, the perfect tone of a wronged mother. By the time Ryan woke, she had already planted the seeds. "She overreacted, honey. You know how sensitive she is. It was an accident and she called the police just to humiliate me." I heard her say it through the vents, her words deliberate, shaped for sympathy. Ryan's reply came quieter, uncertain. "She was bleeding, Mom. And I was shaking," Margaret countered. "She scared me. You know she's been distant for months. Gaslighting I thought precise as a legal argument. When I came downstairs, the house smelled of fresh coffee and deceit. She sat at the breakfast table, pearls back in place, face powdered to perfection, the portrait of dignity. "Good morning, dear," she said, as if nothing had happened. The bruise on my face throbbed under the light. "The officer left his card," I said evenly. "He'll follow up today." Ryan looked between us, the tension thick enough to taste. "Maybe we can all talk this through." He tried, voice pleading. "No one needs to get lawyers involved." Margaret turned toward him, eyes glistening with practiced pain. "Your wife already made that choice." Then she rose and brushed past me, her perfume, a wall between us. I felt the familiar rage rise, the part of me that wanted to shout the truth, loud enough to crack the walls, but I swallowed it down. Quiet power is strategy, not surrender. Within hours, calls started coming: Ryan's aunt, his cousin, his mother's friends. Their voices carried the same message in different tones. "We heard you attacked her. You shouldn't have called the police on family." "She's an old woman, Emma." I said nothing. Every accusation became another layer of proof that silence had been my greatest weapon. Ryan grew distant, trapped between guilt and confusion. That evening, I found him sitting on the porch head in his hands. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted. "Believe the facts," I said softly, handing him my phone. He scrolled through the photos, his hand shaking. "She said you grabbed her, and yet I replied, 'I'm the one with stitches.'" He looked up, tears in his eyes. "I just want it to stop. It will, I promised, but not on her terms." Later, as I packed a small suitcase, Margaret appeared at the doorway, a faint smirk tugging at her mouth. "Running away, dear?" she asked. I zipped the bag, met her gaze, documenting the crime scene. Her smile faltered just slightly. For the first time, she looked uncertain. I moved out that afternoon, leaving behind the perfume of polished furniture and lies. The apartment I rented downtown was small but silent, and silence felt like oxygen again. I lined the kitchen counter with folders labeled each one carefully. Incident report, photos, medical record statements. Evidence was how I breathed now. The bruise darkened over the next few days, yellow blooming under purple, and I photographed it daily like a timeline of truth. Detective Nora Blake called that Monday morning. "We're formalizing the assault report," she said. "You'll need to come in to give a full statement." Her tone carried respect, not pity. When I arrived at the station, I recognized that familiar chill of justice machinery, neutral walls, low hum, fluorescent honesty. I told her everything from start to finish, the dinner, the glass, the years of control leading up to it. She listened like a judge, nodding at precise intervals. "Any witnesses?" she asked. "My husband," I said, and watched her pen pause. "Will he cooperate?" I hesitated. "Eventually." She sighed, the kind of exhale that says she's seen this story too many times before. "We'll subpoena if necessary." I left the station and went straight to my office downtown. My assistant looked at the bruise and didn't ask questions. I drafted a written statement that afternoon, cold, chronological, airtight. The lawyer in me understood something the victim in me hadn't yet grasped. Justice doesn't wait for emotions to settle. It needs paper-proof procedure. That night, I sat in bed with my laptop open, creating a document titled Case Margaret Caldwell. I numbered the sections like a deposition. Exhibit A. Photographs of injuries dated March 12th, 11:47 p.m. Exhibit B. Emergency medical visit summary. Dr. Hahn. Exhibit C. Police report number 2047, Officer Blake. Then I added a note at the bottom. "Keep everything factual. The facts will speak louder than she ever could." The next morning, Detective Blake called again. "Emma, we ran her name through our internal database." She paused. "You might want to sit down." Margaret had 2 prior incident reports, one from a former housekeeper 5 years ago, another from a neighbor last year. Both dropped within days, no charges filed. Influence had its reach. "Patterns," I whispered. "Exactly," Nora said. "If you're willing, we'll reopen those files. It strengthens your case." I closed my eyes and felt the first real spark of power in weeks. "Do it," I said. "Let's build the record she spent her life burying." By the end of that week, Margaret struck back. She didn't need fists or glasses. This time she had reputation, and in her world, that was sharper than any blade. The gossip spread faster than the bruise could fade. At the country club, she told her friends I was unstable, vindictive, and using her son for money. At Ryan's clinic, she showed up with a dramatic bandage on her wrist, sighing to the receptionist that her daughter-in-law had become violent after a few drinks. She knew exactly how to play her audience-polished sympathy with a hint of scandal. Ryan came to see me 2 days later looking like he hadn't slept. "Mom's devastated," he said. "She says you're trying to ruin her." I looked at him exhausted. "She assaulted me, Ryan. I didn't imagine that glass." He rubbed his face. I know, but she's your mother," I said softly, testing him. "And mine, apparently, is the villain." He flinched. "Please don't make me choose." That was the problem he already had, and he didn't even see it. "I'm not asking you to choose," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm asking you to face reality." But Margaret had been shaping his version of reality for 30 years. She didn't need to shout to control. She just needed to imply. 2 days later, I received a letter, formal, embossed legal. a cease and desist from her attorney claiming defamation for false accusations. It was laughable but effective in its own way. She wanted to remind me she still knew how to weaponize the system. I read it once then, twice, and felt something settle inside me. The fear was gone. She had turned this into a war she couldn't win because this battlefield was mine. I responded through my firm sending copies of the police report, medical records, and pending case details. My tone was clinical, detached, surgical. When Ryan called later, his voice was trembling. "You didn't have to escalate this." "I didn't," I said calmly. "She did." He didn't reply, just breathed on the line for a few seconds before hanging up. That night, I poured myself a glass of water, no wine, and watched the city lights blink outside my apartment window. She was unraveling, I could feel it. People like Margaret don't survive exposure. They live on appearances. When you strip that away, all that's left is panic. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to let the truth work quietly, methodically, until her empire of whispers collapsed under its own weight. The first real crack in Margaret's mask came from a place she thought was untouchable, her own past. Detective Nora Blake called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice carrying that tone investigators use when the puzzle finally fits. "Emma," she said, "you were right. There's a pattern and it's uglier than we thought." She sent me the files, scanned reports, typed statements, faded photos. 5 years ago, a housekeeper named Luz Martinez had filed a complaint against Margaret for reckless endangerment after being struck by a serving tray during an argument. The charges were dropped. Of course, Margaret had claimed Luz slipped. 3 years later, another report surfaced from a neighbor, Mr. Delaney, describing verbal threats and intimidation over a property boundary. Again dismissed. "She has a history of aggression disguised as accident," Nora said. "Every victim withdrew within 48 hours. I'd bet money she used influence or intimidation." I felt something cold and satisfying tighten in my chest. "Can we reopen them?" I asked. "Not as criminal cases, but we can use them to establish behavioral pattern in court." Nora replied, "This isn't just about your assault anymore, Emma. It's about her record." That afternoon, I met with my firm's senior partner, Harold. He'd mentored me since law school, the kind of man who measured truth by paperwork. "You have the foundation of a civil suit," he said, flipping through the files. "But if you want impact, make it public. File for a protective order. Press for full disclosure." I knew what that meant, her name in headlines, her friends whispering behind charity brunch tables. The queen of control, stripped of her narrative. I spent the night assembling everything into a single document, the legal equivalent of an autopsy. Paragraph by paragraph, I dissected her manipulation dates, witnesses, patterns, precedents. At the bottom, I added a single note to myself. Truth is the only weapon she can't disarm. The next morning, I submitted the official request for a permanent restraining order and an addendum linking prior incidents. The filing was public record. Within 24 hours, the story was circulating online. Prominent retired judge accused of domestic assault by daughter-in-law. Margaret's friends went silent. Ryan called, voice shaking. "Why would you humiliate her like this?" he demanded. "Because she earned it," I said quietly. There was a pause. "She's saying you're destroying the family." "She destroyed it the moment she drew blood," I replied. He didn't hang up immediately this time. "I don't know who to believe anymore," he whispered. "Then believe the evidence," I said. And for once, he didn't argue. That silence, his silence, felt like the first small victory. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and nerves. I'd walked those halls hundreds of times before, but never as a victim. This time, the marble felt colder under my heels, the echoes sharper. Margaret arrived flanked by her lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit, trying too hard to mask fear with confidence. Her posture was perfect, her pearls immaculate, but her eyes darted constantly, scanning for allies who no longer looked her way. Ryan sat 2 rows behind her, hands clasped, shoulders tense. I wanted to meet his gaze, but I couldn't. Not yet. The hearing began with procedural calm. Detective Blake presented the evidence, first photos, medical records, prior complaints. Her voice was steady, factual, stripped of drama, and that made it more damning. The victim sustained a contusion and laceration above the zygomatic bone, consistent with blunt force trauma, she read. The alleged assailant admitted to consuming alcohol and engaging in a verbal altercation immediately prior to the incident. Margaret's lawyer objected, claiming emotional provocation, a heated moment taken out of context. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Turner, context does not justify violence. When it was my turn, I stood, adjusted my blazer, and walked to the front. Your Honor, I began, my voice low but unwavering. This isn't about a broken glass. It's about a pattern, a lifetime of control disguised as care, of intimidation wrapped in etiquette. This time she crossed into physical harm, but emotional harm has been her craft for years. I placed the files on the table one by one, each labeled dated and damning. Exhibit C, prior assault report filed by Luz Martinez. Exhibit D, harassment complaint by Charles Delaney, both withdrawn under suspiciously similar circumstances. I looked directly at Margaret. How many people have you hurt, Mrs. Caldwell, and how many times did you call it an accident? Her jaw clenched, the mask fracturing for a moment. I raised my son alone, she said, voice trembling but still defiant. You can't possibly understand what that takes. No, I replied softly, but I understand what it takes to stop enabling cruelty. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Ryan shifted behind her, his hands dropping from his lap. The judge leaned forward. In light of the evidence and the defendant's demonstrated pattern of behavior, I grant the petitioner's request for a permanent restraining order. Margaret inhaled sharply, her lawyer frozen. The gavel struck once, decisive echoing. As the bailiff escorted her out, she turned to me. Her eyes filled not with rage, but disbelief. She had always believed she was untouchable. For the first time, she understood she wasn't. The weeks after the court ruling unfolded like the slow unraveling of a fabric too tightly pulled for too long. Margaret's world, once a fortress of reputation and influence, began to crack. The country club suspended her membership pending internal review. Her bridge group stopped answering calls. Even her oldest friend Evelyn, who used to defend her at every gossip table, avoided eye contact at the grocery store. For someone like Margaret, exile wasn't about distance, it was about silence. And the silence around her grew deafening. Ryan moved out of her house 3 days after the hearing. He showed up at my apartment late one evening, eyes hollow, suitcase in hand. I didn't ask where he planned to go. I simply stepped aside to let him in. We didn't talk for hours, just sat on opposite ends of the couch, the city noise filtering through the window like background static. Finally, he said, "She told me I'd regret choosing you." His voice cracked raw and small. "But when she looked at you in court, it was like watching her realize she wasn't God anymore." I didn't respond. He wasn't asking for comfort. He was confessing his awakening. In the following days, letters started arriving at my firm, anonymous ones, some angry, some apologetic. The public had opinions as they always do, but the law had already spoken. I focused on work, rebuilding case by case, finding rhythm again in logic and paperwork. Yet there were nights I still woke to the sound of shattering glass echoes that lived in my bones more than in my mind. One morning, Detective Blake called. "Just a courtesy update," she said. "Margaret Caldwell sold her property last week. The restraining order remains in effect. She's moving out of state." I didn't ask where. Geography wasn't the point anymore. "Thank you," I said. "You did the right thing, Emma," she replied. "Most people never press charges against family." I hung up and sat there for a long while, realizing she was right. It hadn't been about revenge. It had been about ending the lineage of silence. A few days later, I drove past the old Caldwell house. The curtains were gone, the lawn unkept, a for sale sign, tilted slightly in the wind. I parked for a moment, the bruise long healed, but the memory still vivid. The woman who once controlled every inch of that house was gone, and all that was left was wood paint and echoes. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just quietly empties a house. As I pulled away, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, just the strange, steady peace that comes when truth finally outlasts the noise. Healing wasn't cinematic. It didn't arrive with sunrise or music swelling in the background. It came in fragments the first morning I woke without checking the door lock twice. The first dinner I cooked without feeling watched. The the first laugh that escaped me without guilt. I started therapy reluctantly at first. Dr. Levine, a calm woman in her 50s, had that unnerving ability to sit through silence without flinching. "You've lived under control for so long," she said during our third session, "that even peace feels suspicious." She was right. I kept waiting for the next blow, the next accusation, the next manipulation disguised as concern. My body knew war better than rest. It took weeks to unlearn that reflex. Work helped. I threw myself into pro bono cases, women seeking restraining orders, tenants fighting landlords, anyone whose voice was being buried under power. I understood them now not as clients, but as mirrors. Each case became a quiet act of reclamation. One afternoon, while preparing documents in the office library, Ryan appeared at the door. He looked older, softer around the edges. "I came to thank you," he said simply, "for standing up, for not letting her bury you. Or me." I set my pen down, unsure how to respond. "She was your mother," I said. "You did what sons do, you tried to believe her. And you did what people of strength do," he replied. "You stopped her." The silence between us wasn't bitter anymore. It was acceptance. When he left, I didn't feel emptiness. I felt space, the kind that breathes. That weekend, I drove out to the coast to a stretch of beach I used to visit in law school. The ocean was gray and restless, the air cold enough to sting my cheeks. I sat on a rock and let the wind push against me until I could barely stand it. And then I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I was still here. Alive. Unbroken. The bruise had faded from my skin, but its echo had turned into something else resolve. I took out my phone, opened a blank note, and typed 3 words. Quiet Power Project. It wasn't a case file or a lawsuit. It was an idea, a foundation to help women document, defend, and reclaim their stories before anyone rewrote them. Justice. I realized doesn't end with one verdict. It begins when someone refuses to stay silent. The tide came in, brushing over my shoes, cold but cleansing. For the first time in months, I didn't step back. I let it reach me. The idea started small. A single email draft saved under Someday. I wrote, a platform to help survivors of domestic and emotional abuse gather, organize, and protect their evidence so no one can gaslight them out of truth again. I didn't send it that night. I let it sit like a seed in winter. But the thought kept returning, persistent as breath. A month later, I filed the incorporation papers, the Quiet Power Foundation, a legal and digital resource for victims to reclaim control through documentation and education. It wasn't about charity. It was about empowerment. My first volunteers were women I'd represented during pro bono cases. One of them, a nurse named Camille, had once whispered to me in the hallway of the courthouse, "You're the first person who believed me." When she read the mission statement, she cried and said, "Now I get to believe someone else." We worked out of my living room, at first the coffee table covered in laptops and law books. Within weeks, we had built an online portal where users could securely upload evidence, generate police report templates, and access legal resources tailored by state. Every night, I'd read the messages that poured in, stories written at 2 a.m., shaking hands, typing in the dark. "He says no one will believe me. He says I'm crazy. Please tell me what to do." And every time I thought, you start by writing it down. You start by keeping the receipts. The foundation gained attention faster than I expected. Local news picked it up first, then national outlets followed. Former attorney turns trauma into tool for justice. They called me a survivor, an activist, a trailblazer. I didn't feel like any of those things. I felt like a woman who had finally turned fear into fuel. Detective Nora Blake visited one afternoon, dropping off a donation envelope. "You're making more noise than any court order ever could," she said with a half smile. That's how real change begins. Even Ryan contributed quietly through one of our fundraising channels, no message, just a small note on the transaction for truth. The staff grew, the inbox filled, the mission deepened. And one night, as I stood before a crowd of donors at a small benefit gala, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass wall behind the stage. The woman looking back at me wasn't the one bleeding at a dinner table. She was composed, clear-eyed, powerful in stillness. I ended the speech with the words that had become our motto: "Quiet doesn't mean weak. Stillness isn't surrender, and truth once spoken can't be silenced. The applause rose like a tide, steady and certain. 6 months after the verdict, I received a letter in handwriting I recognized instantly, the elegant, deliberate script of someone who still believed cursive could command respect. It came from an out-of-state address, no return name, but the scent of lavender and control clung to the paper. For a moment, I considered tossing it unopened, but curiosity, the same one that made me a good attorney, won. The letter began, Emma, I suppose congratulations are in order. You've managed to turn one mistake into a career. I read every word, not because I cared what she thought, but because it was the perfect reminder of who she'd always been, incapable of remorse, fluent in manipulation. Ryan doesn't speak to me anymore, she wrote. I hope you're proud. You've taken everything from me. I folded it carefully and slipped it into the evidence folder not as proof of threat, but of closure. Her words no longer had power. Later that week, I was invited to give a talk at a law symposium about digital evidence and domestic justice. When I walked onto that stage, the auditorium was full. But it wasn't fear that filled me, it was clarity. I spoke about the illusion of privacy, the importance of documentation, the danger of silence disguised as loyalty. And then I told my story not in full detail, but enough to make the air shift. Justice, I said, isn't about revenge. It's about realignment. It's when truth stops whispering and starts echoing. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was sustained, a wave of quiet understanding. After the session, a woman in her 60s approached me. I was you, she said softly. 30 years ago. I wish I'd had your courage. I shook her hand and smiled. You still do, I said. That evening, as I left the university, the air carried that early autumn coolness that smells like possibility. I stopped by a cafe on the corner, ordered tea, and sat by the window. Across the street, a mother and her teenage daughter laughed over a shared pastry. For the first time, the sight didn't ache, it healed. My phone buzzed a message from Ryan Hurd about your foundation on the news. Proud of you. I typed back, thank you. I hope you're okay. He replied with a photo of a small apartment, sunlight streaming through new curtains. Getting there. I smiled. The cycle had broken. As I stepped outside, the city lights blurred into gold, and for a fleeting moment I thought of Margaret somewhere far away, nursing her grudges in silence. The thought didn't bring anger or pity, just peace. Justice had done its work. A year later, the house that once echoed with commands and criticism stood empty. I saw it in a newspaper photo accompanying a real estate listing. Historic colonial home recently vacated, available immediately. The same chandeliers, the same manicured hedges, but it looked smaller now, stripped of its authority. Power, I realized, doesn't come from marble floors or family names. It comes from truth, and truth had moved out long ago. The Quiet Power Foundation had grown beyond anything I expected. We'd partnered with state legal aid offices, launched training programs for law students, and published a national guide on evidence preservation. Every week I received letters from women and men who had escaped the kind of homes that looked perfect from the outside. You gave me a map out, one wrote. You made me believe silence isn't noble. I framed that one. It reminded me why I'd endured what I did. On the anniversary of the assault, I visited the courthouse not for bitterness but gratitude. The marble no longer felt cold. It felt earned. Detective Nora Blake met me at the steps, her smile soft but proud. You've done more good in 1 year than most of us manage in a decade, she said. How's Ryan? He's healing, I replied. Different city, different life. She nodded. Sometimes survival means distance. We walked together to the parking lot, the late afternoon sun spilling gold over the pavement. You know, she said, the system's slow, but when it works because of people like you. I watched her leave, then turned toward my car, pausing as the wind picked up. Somewhere behind me, inside that courthouse, another woman was probably testifying, trembling, holding her own photos as proof. And maybe when she looked up, she'd remember a headline, a story, a name, and know she wasn't alone. That night, I sat on my balcony with tea in hand, watching the city hum beneath a deep blue sky. My reflection in the glass window looked calm, older, unbreakable. I thought about the glass that shattered that night, how it once symbolized humiliation, violence, chaos. Now I imagined those shards scattered under the moonlight refracting something stronger, resilience. Pain had become architecture. Fear had become fuel. As I closed my laptop, I whispered to the quiet around me, "Justice isn't loud." The silence answered steady and sure, "But it lasts." And it did.